was well past midnight when the subway train shuddered to a halt at the dimly lit station. I was on my way back to my apartment, tired from a long day at work and eager to get home. The train was mostly empty, save for a few scattered passengers, and I found a seat by the window, grateful for the quiet. As the train pulled out of the station, I noticed a figure standing on the platform, barely visible through the grimy window. It was a man in a dark coat, his face hidden by a shadowed hood. I didn't think much of it, assuming he was just another late-night traveler waiting for the next train. A few stops later, the train came to a screeching halt at another station. I looked up from my book, and to my surprise, the same man from the previous station was now on this platform. I could make out his figure more clearly now. He was standing still, staring directly at the train. I felt a shiver run down my spine. It was odd that he was at two different stations, but I dismissed it as coincidence. As the train continued its journey, my unease grew. At each subsequent station, I saw the same man standing on the platform, always at the edge of the platform, always watching the train with a fixed gaze. He never moved. And, though I couldn't see his face clearly, something about his presence was deeply unsettling. I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence or that the man was perhaps waiting for someone, but the pattern was too unnerving to ignore. Each time the train stopped, he was there, always in the same position, always watching. By the time the train reached the next station, my heart was pounding. I was the only passenger left in my car. The thought of the man following the train from station to station made my skin crawl. I decided I needed to get off and take a cab, but the thought of encountering that man on the platform was terrifying. As the train doors opened, I hesitated, peering down the empty platform. To my horror, the man was there, standing closer now, his dark coat and hood almost blending into the shadows. His gaze was fixed on me, and for the first time I could see his eyes, cold, empty, and unblinking. I quickly stepped back into the train, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The doors closed behind me, and I sat down, trying to calm myself. The train started moving again, and I glanced out of the window. The man was still there, now standing directly in front of the train, as if he had been waiting for me to leave the car. With a jolt, the train entered a dark tunnel. The lights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I could still feel the man's gaze on me, even though he was no longer visible. The thought of him waiting at every station, following me, made me feel trapped and vulnerable. The train finally pulled into the next station. As the doors opened, I took a deep breath and prepared to step out. To my relief, the platform was empty, but the unsettling feeling lingered. I hurried up the stairs to the street level, casting glances over my shoulder, but I didn't see the man anywhere. I eventually made it home, but the night's events left me restless. I couldn't shake the feeling that the man had been more than a mere coincidence, that he had been watching me, waiting for me. The next day, I found out that there had been reports of similar sightings of the same man at multiple stations throughout the city, but no one knew who he was or what he wanted. To this day, whenever I ride the subway late at night, I keep a wary eye on the platforms, always hoping I won't see that same shadowy figure again. The subway car rattled along the tracks, the rhythmic clatter a constant background noise, as I leaned back in my seat, trying to relax after a long day of classes. It was nearly midnight, and the train was almost empty. Just a few scattered passengers, most of them dozing off or absorbed in their phones. The flickering fluorescent lights overhead added to the eerie, deserted atmosphere of the late-night commute. As I absent-mindedly scrolled through social media on my phone, I felt an odd sensation, like someone was watching me. I looked up and scanned the car, spotting a man seated across from me. He was in his late 30s, with unkempt hemp hair and a worn-out jacket. But it wasn't his appearance that caught my attention. It was his eyes. They were fixed on me, unblinking and intense. I glanced away quickly, trying to dismiss the feeling of discomfort. Maybe he was just lost in thought, staring into space. But as the train continued to rumble through the dark tunnels, I couldn't shake the feeling of his gaze burning into me. I glanced up again, and sure enough, he was still staring. This time his expression had changed. There was a hint of a smile playing on his lips, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. My heart rate quickened. I shifted in my seat, trying to focus on my phone, but the words and images blurred together. I checked the time and the subway map, only a few stops left until the end of the line. I decided to ignore him, hoping he would lose interest. Minutes passed, but the unease only grew. I sneaked another look. He hadn't moved, still watching me with that same unsettling expression. It was as if he was studying me, waiting for something. The train pulled into a station, and a few more passengers got on, but the man remained in his seat, never breaking eye contact. Anxious, I decided to change seats, moving to the far end of the car, closer to the exit. For a moment I felt a small relief, thinking that maybe he would stay put. But as the train started moving again, I glanced back and saw him rise from his seat. He walked slowly, deliberately, and sat down just a few seats away from me. Panic flared in my chest. He was following me. I tried to stay calm, thinking of my options. The train was nearing the last stop, and once we reached it, the passengers would be forced to disembark. The thought of being on an empty platform with him made my stomach twist. I needed to come up with a plan. As we approached the next station, I stood up abruptly and headed toward the doors, pretending to prepare to get off. The train came to a stop, and I could see the man from the corner of my eye. He hesitated, then stood up too, clearly intending to follow me. My heart pounded in my ears as the doors slid open, and I made a split-second decision. I bolted out of the train car, not looking back, and dashed toward the exit stairs. As I ran, I could hear footsteps behind me, quick and determined. My breath came in short, panicked gasps. The station was nearly deserted, the echoes of our footsteps the only sound. Reaching the top of the stairs, I spotted a ticket booth with a lone attendant. I ran up to the glass, pounding on it and shouting help. That man is following me. The attendant looked up, startled, as I pointed to the man who had just reached the top of the stairs. The man froze, seeing that I had drawn attention. His expression twisted with frustration, and he quickly turned and disappeared back down the stairs, fleeing into the night. The attendant called security, and a few minutes later, a guard arrived, taking my statement and offering to escort me to my destination. My hands were still shaking, and my voice was unsteady as I recounted the events. I glanced around nervously, half expecting the man to reappear from the shadows. The security guard reassured me and walked me to the bus stop, staying with me until my bus arrived. As I boarded, I couldn't help but look over my shoulder one last time, scanning the dark streets for any sign of the man. Just as the bus was about to pull away, I saw a familiar figure at the far end of the platform, standing under a flickering streetlight. It was him. His eyes locked onto mine, and he raised his hand in a slow, deliberate wave. The bus doors closed, separating us, but the image of him standing there, watching me leave, was burned into my mind. I sat down in a daze, my heart racing. The bus pulled away from the station, but the man's unsettling smile stayed with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, that somehow, somewhere, he would find me again. It was one of those long, exhausting days at the end of the semester. After a late-night study session in the library, I decided to head back to my dorm. The campus was quiet, and the subway was nearly deserted at this hour. I boarded the last train home, grateful for the solitude, hoping to relax and clear my head before getting some sleep. As the train rumbled along the tracks, I took a seat in an empty car and pulled out my phone to pass the time. The dim lights flickered slightly, casting eerie shadows on the empty seats. The rhythmic clattering of the train was oddly soothing, and I found myself drifting off, staring blankly at my screen. At the next station, the train came to a slow, screeching halt. The doors slid open with a mechanical hiss, and I glanced up, expecting to see no one. But a figure emerged from the shadows and stepped into the car. It was a man, roughly in his mid-30s, wearing a rumpled jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He looked disheveled, with a shadow of stubble on his face and a slight stagger in his step. Something about him put me on edge. Maybe it was the late hour or the isolation of the subway car, but my gut told me to be cautious. I returned my gaze to my phone, trying to appear casual and uninterested. The stranger took a seat a few rows down, facing away from me. At first he seemed to settle in, but then he started to shift restlessly. He muttered to himself, his voice too low for me to catch any words. Every few moments he'd look over his shoulder, glancing at me with a strange intensity. My unease grew with each glance. As the train plunged into the dark tunnels, the man's behavior became more erratic. He began pacing up and down the aisle, his footsteps echoing in the empty car. He would stop at random intervals, muttering under his breath and gesturing wildly. At one point, he reached into his jacket, and I held my breath, terrified of what he might pull out. But he only retrieved a crumpled piece of paper, which he stared at intently before shoving it back into his pocket. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. My heart pounded in my chest, and I forced myself to think clearly. I was alone in a moving train with an unstable stranger. There was no way to leave the car, and the next station was still several minutes away. My phone was my only lifeline, but I was hesitant to make a call, fearing it might provoke him. As he continued his erratic pacing, the man suddenly stopped and turned to face me. His eyes were wide, and he wore an unsettling grin. "You think you're safe, don't you?" he said, his voice loud and clear now. The suddenness of his words made me jump. I forced a nervous smile, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just trying to get home," I replied, hoping to diffuse whatever situation this was. My mind raced, searching for a plan. Should I move to another car at the next stop? Call the police? What if he got violent? The man seemed to ponder my response, his head cocked to one side. Then, without warning, he started laughing, a harsh, grating sound that echoed in the confined space. It sent a chill down my spine. He stepped closer, and I instinctively backed up against the wall, my fingers tightening around my phone. "I know things," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Secrets. They think I'm crazy, but I know what's really going on." He glanced around the car as if checking for eavesdroppers. "You shouldn't trust anyone, especially not them." I had no idea who they were, but I knew I needed to get out of this situation. The train slowed as it approached the next station. I decided that as soon as the doors opened, I would make a run for it. I couldn't afford to stay trapped in this car with him any longer. As the train pulled into the station, the man seemed to sense my plan. His expression darkened, and he took a step closer. My pulse quickened. The moment the doors slid open, I bolted from my seat, sprinting down the platform without looking back. I heard him shout something behind me, but I didn't stop to listen. I raced up the stairs and out of the station, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Once I reached the street level, I glanced around, trying to see if he had followed me. The station was quiet, and there was no sign of him. Only the distant hum of city life broke the silence. I quickly dialed campus security and explained what had happened. They assured me they would send someone to escort me back to my dorm. As I waited on the dark, empty street, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, Every distant footstep made my heart leap. When the security officer arrived, I felt a wave of relief. He was a tall, burly man with a reassuring presence. We began walking back toward campus, the streetlights casting long shadows on the sidewalk. As we approached a quieter part of the route, I glanced over my shoulder one last time. In the distance, under the flickering light of a street lamp, I saw him, the man from the subway. He was standing perfectly still, his face obscured by the brim of his hat, watching us. I felt a surge of fear, but before I could react, the security officer turned to me and said, "It's not safe out here alone at night. You never know who might be watching." He spoke with a strange emphasis on the last word, sending a chill down my spine. I looked at him, trying to gauge his expression, but his face remained neutral. We continued walking, and as we rounded a corner, the man from the subway disappeared from view. But the officer's words echoed in my mind, leaving me with a deep sense of unease. Was he just giving friendly advice, or did he know something more? As we neared the campus gates, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being followed, that the night held secrets I was yet to uncover. And in that moment, I realized that the real danger might not have been left behind on the subway. It was still with me, waiting to reveal itself.